He did not enter this world merely as a prince. He was the son of two legends. His mother, Hurrem, the slave who became Sultana, a force that bent the laws to her will. His father, Suleiman the Magnificent, the lord of the age, whose shadow stretched across half the world. His name was Cihangir, conqueror of the world. A name, a heavy inheritance, a prophecy fate would twist into a cruel irony. His world from the very beginning was not a palace but a labyrinth where gilding concealed steel traps, and a whisper behind one's back was sharper than a yataghan. The year is 1531. The palace rejoices at the birth of a şehzade. Yet in that jubilation there is a crack. The child is not quite like the others. He was born with a congenital affliction, a hunchback, and, by some accounts, a curvature of the spine. In an empire where the Sultan's physical perfection was a symbol of divine favor and strength, this was not merely a flaw, it was a political vulnerability, a seal that crossed out the paramount dream of any Ottoman prince, the fight for the throne. Yet this very fact made him unique. Incapable of becoming a direct rival, he became the most beloved. For Hurrem, a fragile treasure in need of protection. For Suleiman, an intellectual companion, a son unburdened by the heavy weight of ambition, and thus a pure object of paternal tenderness. Cihangir grew in the rays of this love, the most dangerous kind in the harem. He was lavished with knowledge, poetry, calligraphy, sciences. He became a refined connoisseur of the arts, his mind sharpened by the finest intellects of the empire. He was the golden boy, gifted, sensitive, observant.
He lived in a gilded cage, woven from the silk of parental love and the velvet of eternal guardianship. Beyond its confines, a true storm raged. The law of Fatih, the ruthless mechanism of succession, hung over his elder brothers, Mustafa, Selim, and Bayezid, like a whetted blade. Cihangir could only watch and admire, especially his half-brother Mustafa, the perfect warrior, beloved by the army and the people, the living embodiment of all that Cihangir could never be physically. Mustafa was for him the image of another, impossible world, a world of strength, open spaces, and martial honor. This attachment became his thread of fate. His story is not the story of a warrior or a ruler. It is the story of a witness, a naive, vulnerable witness, endowed with a keen intellect to understand the rules of a game he could not join. His soul was a distorted mirror, reflecting all the fears, intrigues, and inevitable cruelty of the age. His personal tragedy is the tragedy of humanity, locked inside an inhuman system. The tragedy of a son doomed to love the one whom the power machine of his own family was meant to destroy. Just 22 years, from birth to a quiet yet deafening end. His fate is not a footnote in a chronicle, but a full-bodied drama, a drama of how the most gifted and fragile being is broken when love, betrayal, and cold state necessity collide in a single bloody knot. His story does not begin with war, but with a quiet sob in a cradle rocked by the hand of the empire's most powerful woman, and it would end where all roads ended for superfluous princes, in silence. Our journey through palace intrigues is just beginning, and so you don't miss other stories like this, click that magical subscribe button and the bell next to it. This helps the channel grow and helps us find the most compelling stories for you and create even better videos. Top copy. Not just a palace, but a giant breathing organism where every whisper in the carved corridors has a price and every sigh can be a political act. Here, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, at the peak of its glory, Şehzade Cihangir is born. His arrival was meant to be the final perfect chord in the symphony of power of Suleiman and Hurrem. 4 sons, 1 daughter, the golden family of the ruling sultan. The child's name is chosen with grandeur, Conqueror of the world. Not a wish, but a statement of fact. His father, Suleiman the Magnificent, was at that very time continuing to conquer the world, preparing for new campaigns. In the mosques, prayers are said for the newborn conqueror. Treasurers scatter gold to the crowd at the gates. The air seems thick with incense and universal joy.
And so this universal celebration shatters against the quiet, private horror of two people, the Sultan and his wife. The baby's first cry, its first examination, and the piercing silence that follows. The joy lasted precisely until the moment the swaddling clothes were unfolded. Cihangir came into this world with a mark that could not be concealed by golden robes or lofty titles. A pronounced hump, a curved spine, an asymmetry of his entire body. The Ottoman chronicles, with their laconic precision, simply state the fact, an ailment from birth. Modern physicians, looking back, posit a probable diagnosis, spinal dysplasia, not merely a cosmetic defect, but a condition condemning him to chronic pain, to unhealing sores on the skin of his back, to lameness and physical weakness. In an empire where the ideal ruler was an athlete warrior on horseback, this infant, from his first breath, was cast outside the main narrative. He was a şehzade, but not a warrior, a prince, but not a contender, a conqueror of worlds, scarcely able to keep his own body in balance. And here begins the real story, not the state narrative, but the palace one. A story not of imperial triumph, but of a quiet, desperate parental love flourishing in the most unnatural conditions for it. Hurrem, the woman who had risen from slave to Suleiman's only lawful wife, saw in this fragile child a reflection of her own vulnerability. Her letters to the Sultan are not mere reports, they are cries of the soul, encrypted within diplomatic lines. Our Cihangir suffers from sores on his shoulder, but the physicians performed a procedure, and the shoulder is now better. Behind this phrase lie nights at his bedside, the scent of healing ointments of saffron and musk, whispered prayers over amulets with verses from the Quran, a desperate attempt at alchemy to mix the best medicine of the era with faith and a mother's warmth to cure the incurable. She fought not merely for her son's health, she fought for his place in this cruel world, where physical imperfection was often equated with weakness of spirit.
And Suleiman, the ruler of half the known world, the formidable Kanuni, reveals another facet in this private drama, ones he usually entrusted only to paper under the poetic pseudonym Muhibi, the lover. To Cihangir, he was not so much the commander of the faithful as a father, the one who brought miniatures, who could spend an evening reading poetry in the cozy quarters of the harem, rather than receiving viziers in the divan. This tenderness was the rarest currency in the Ottoman dynasty, and perhaps became the greatest gift Cihangir received from fate. His early years were a life in the most luxurious isolation possible, while his brothers, first Mehmed and later Selim and Bayezid, underwent the harsh schooling of governing sanjaks, learning to command armies and administer justice. Cihangir remained in Istanbul. His world was confined to his mother's chambers, his father's library, the gardens of Topkapi, under the watchful eyes of eunuchs and nannies. He was a domestic prince, and that title in the Ottoman context sounded like a verdict: gentle, educated, but unfit for serious matters. His sensitivity, heightened by illness and seclusion, became his character. Chronicles preserve a touching and eerie detail. Little Cihangir would cry upon seeing his father in armor. He was not bidding farewell to a triumphant conqueror, but to the very man who read him poetry. He sensed not the glory of new conquests, but the void that would remain after his departure. In those tears lies the very essence of his position. He was a spectator in the epic saga of his family. He understood the price of the Imperial theater because he watched it not from the stage, but from behind the scenes, seeing the armor and makeup being put on. From birth until his last breath, Cihangir's body was his fortress and his prison. Not a gilded cage, as with other princes, but precisely a prison of flesh and bone, the key to which was lost at birth. His hunchback, not merely a medical term, but the main character of his personal drama, determining every step, every glance, every unfulfilled dream.
From the very first days in the Topkapi harem, it was clear. This şehzade would not follow the path of his ancestors. While his brothers, Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, were learning to wield a sword and a scepter, Cihangir was learning to bear pain. Kyphosis, a curvature of the spine, deformed not only his back, but the very trajectory of his life. The Ottoman Empire, a state built on cavalry campaigns and martial glory, did not know what to do with a prince who could barely cross a hall without support. In the dispatches of observers like Ogier de Busbecq, there is not only the statement of the fact of a lameness from birth, but also a cold acknowledgement of political inadequacy. Here, weakness was equated not with illness, but with treason against the state. A body that refused to straighten became an act of defiance against the system itself. What went wrong in the womb of the empire's most powerful woman? Historians and physicians have been conducting a quiet debate across the centuries. Ottoman chroniclers attributed it all to divine will, a convenient explanation absolving the dynasty of responsibility. Modern analysis digs deeper into the biological underpinnings. Theory number 1, spinal dysplasia, a malfunction in the very program of vertebra formation. The cause? A genetic lottery, or the consequences of infections suffered by Hurrem. It is worth remembering that Hurrem gave birth almost without pause, 6 children in 12 years. Her body, perhaps depleted by the time of her last pregnancy with Cihangir, may have exhausted its resources. Seclusion in the harem, deprived of sunlight, could have led to a vitamin D deficiency and rickets, affecting the fetus's bone formation. There are darker hypotheses as well about tuberculosis or syphilis, scourges of that era. Each of these theories transforms the harem from luxurious chambers into the epicenter of a quiet biological war, where invisible enemies struck at the most vulnerable target, the future of a prince. The medicine of that time fought the ailment with methods balancing on the edge of alchemy and despair. Healers used surgical incisions to set and cleanse non-healing wounds, applied poultices of wine and saffron. Doctors encased his curved spine in corsets of leather and metal, Aucklish prosthetics meant to force the body to obey etiquette, but which only dug into his flesh, reminding him of futility. Each such corset was a metaphor for his position, rigid frames into which they tried to squeeze a life not meant for them. All of this forged a character distinct from the boisterous temper of his brothers. His world narrowed to libraries, the workshops of calligraphers, and poetic divans. If his brothers measured their strength on campaigns, he measured his wit in salons. Contemporaries noted his sharp, melancholic mind. But this compensation with genius is often a comforting myth we invent for solace. The reality was more bitter. Every glance furtively cast at his figure, every whisper behind his back about corruption or poisoning in the womb, all of this gnawed at him from within. He was doomed to be intelligent because his body would not allow him to be strong.
His intellect was not a gift, but a forced fortress, erected for defense. His tragedy is also a unique window into Ottoman medicine and social relations. Without antibiotics, every unhealed wound on his hunchback risked sepsis. Every successful operation by physicians could ultimately prove fatal. Interestingly, Cihangir, himself disabled, became the unofficial patron of those like him. He funded baths and foundations for the sick and the lame, a rare gesture in a society that valued physical perfection almost as a cult. In this was a quiet rebellion, the creation of an alternative community for those whom the empire preferred not to notice. The gilded cage. This cliché exists precisely because it describes the bitterest reality. You can be the most precious, most pampered bird in the world, but the bars do not become softer for it. Cihangir's life in Topkapi is the canonical example of this paradox. His world was carpeted with Persian rugs. His morning began with prayer in his private chambers under the quiet voice of the muezzin, and his lunch consisted of exquisite dishes that court physicians personally checked to ensure they would not trigger pain in his curved spine. Baklava, adapted for the prince's weak stomach, this is not just a dessert, it is a symbol of a life where even pleasures had to be maimed so they would not cause harm. His day was scheduled by the minute, like that of any şehzade, but with one fundamental correction. While Selim and Bayezid practiced saber strikes in the courtyard and learned to manage a horse, Cihangir mastered the art of sitting. Sitting correctly, with dignity, hiding beneath layers of divan cushions and embroidered silk covers the body that refused to obey him. He attended meetings of the divan, not as a participant, but as a living icon of family loyalty, placed in the most prominent spot by Hurrem Sultan. Nod, my son, look intelligent, show your father that your mind is sharp, even if your body has failed.
The daily life of the şehzade was a theatre where every object was a prop. The silver cane on which he leaned was not just a support, it was the sceptre of his personal diminished kingdom. The palanquin carried by 4 servants was not a luxury, but the sole means of transportation, a moving cage. His retinue, the faithful eunuch, his Srev Aga, his personal pasha, Gul Aga, the eunuchs who read him chronicles, was not merely a staff, it was his crew, his team on a ship that never sailed from the dock. If history were a TV series, the year 1551 would be the moment when the viewer realizes there will be no happy ending for the hero. Cihangir is 20. In a world where a man is defined by his ability to mount a horse and wield a scimitar, he is a living contradiction. His body, crippled by a hunched back and scoliosis, doesn't just ache, it betrays him every single day. The chronic pain in his spine is not background noise, it's the main soundtrack of his existence. The unhealing wounds on his back, likely trophic ulcers from constant pressure and poor circulation, emit a smell even ambergris cannot mask. The seizures, resembling epilepsy, are lightning bolts in the clear sky of his consciousness. Doctors whisper about the evil eye or a curse, but we can surmise spinal tuberculosis, Pott's disease, slowly devouring his vertebrae, or perhaps a severe form of spinal dysplasia, diagnoses from the future in a world that treats illness with bloodletting. His universe shrinks to the chambers of Topkapi. He is not a warrior, not a hunter, he is an observer. European ambassadors report the şehzade is pale and gaunt, spending his days with books and composing poetry. Herein lies his strength and his curse. He sees and understands more than many healthy courtiers.
His mind is a sharp blade, but sheathed in the silk of melancholy. The only unwavering shore in this sea of pain was Hurrem. She called him my swan, a creature too fragile and beautiful for this cruel world. Her letters, filled with maternal anxiety, were his oxygen. And then thunder struck. The year 1553, October, the execution of Mustafa.
Here we must pause for a moment. Mustafa was not just a half-brother, the son of the despised Mahidevran. For Cihangir, whose condition stripped him of any real political threat, Mustafa was a figure of a different order. The elder, the strong one, the embodiment of the warrior ideal, everything Cihangir could never be. Perhaps there was not only fraternal affection, but also a painful admiration, mingled with a longing for a different fate of his own. And this man, the very incarnation of Ottoman might, was strangled with a silk cord in the tent of his father, Sultan Suleiman, on the slanderous advice of Rustem Pasha, the husband of his sister Mihrimah. Cihangir did not simply weep. The chronicles paint a picture of a profound existential collapse. He sobbed, prophesying, "Now it is my turn." He understood the mechanics of the machinery of power better than most. If the great Mustafa had fallen, what could protect him, frail and sickly, especially since he had been on good terms with him? His tears were not just grief, but a horrifying revelation. After this, his decline became precipitous. The illness, dormant for years, entered its final aggressive stage. Fever, paralysis in the limbs, hallucinations. The symptoms were now not merely of a chronic ailment, but of an acute crisis. Sepsis from infected wounds, the rupture of tubercular abscesses, a brain refusing to accept reality. Likely, all of it together. The physicians, following the protocols of the era, only hastened the end. Bloodlettings weakened an already exhausted body, and opium-laced laudanum plunged him into nightmarish visions. Suleiman, gripped by belated remorse and paternal fear, tried to act. In 1552, even before Mustafa's execution, he took his son on a campaign to Edirne, hoping that fresh air and a change of scenery would heal him. It was a catastrophe. The roads of that time, the jolting in a palanquin or on a cart, were torture for a healthy spine. For Cihangir, with his wounds and deformities, it was hell. Every pothole drove another nail into his suffering. It was in Edirne, during yet another such health-restoring campaign, that the end came. November 1553, the Sultan's tent. Around him were not doctors, but silent eunuchs. Cihangir died far from Istanbul, in a military setting that had always been hostile to him. His final breath was received by the father, whose love had proven as tyrannical and destructive as his wrath.
But there is another version to this story. Not a tragic one, but an openly Gothic one. The kind that cannot be whispered even in the darkest coffee house in Istanbul, yet was transcribed with avid horror in the dispatches of European spies. Imagine that very tent in Edirne, not a place of quiet death throes, but a theater for the final, unthinkable act of a family drama. According to these rumors, laudanum, the opium tincture given to Cihangir as medicine, played a different role here. It did not dull the pain, but loosened the tongue. Under the influence of the drug, in the crucible of unimaginable anguish following Mustafa's execution, the young prince may have found within himself what was not there before: a furious, desperate courage. And he turned to his father not as an obedient son, but as an accuser. Words that had accumulated over years, of injustice, of fratricide, of betrayal, burst forth. He did not merely weep, he denounced. And before him, Suleiman,
not the magnificent Sultan with the Imperial seal, but a gaunt, aged man who had just ordered the death of his firstborn. His psyche hangs by a thread. Remorse, rage, grief, and absolute all-consuming power that tolerates no reproach, even from a beloved son, mix into one volatile cocktail. And in that electrically charged silence of the tent, beneath the howling wind outside, something irrevocable occurs. A flash of rage, an instantaneous reflexive strike. A knife, a dagger, a penknife, it matters not. What matters is the result. A mortal wound, inflicted not by order, but in a blur of passion. This version is not from the Ottoman chronicles. They maintain a sepulchral silence. It came from the dispatches of Ambassador Niccolo Michiel and Habsburg agents. For them, such a detail, a sultan committing filicide, was not a horror, but priceless political intelligence exposing the tyrant. The Janissaries, of course, were presented with the elegant legend of a broken heart. The truth of a spontaneous killing in the tent could have exploded the army, for whom the dynasty was sacred. But in the quiet chancelleries of Vienna and Venice, this truth was carefully recorded, stamped with the mark, verified. So who, in the end, was Cihangir in his final moment? A victim of illness, of history, of poison, or the most terrible victim of all, an involuntary witness who dared to speak truth to power and paid for it not by the law of the dynasty, but by the whim of human despair? It is a version that history does not confirm, but does not entirely refute either, leaving behind a cold, metallic aftertaste.
And then, the magnificent, cynical spectacle of imperial mourning. The body was embalmed with musk and camphor, transported back to the capital. 1,000 janissaries in mourning garb, an artillery salute from many cannons, honors he did not have in life. Suleiman would compose a piercing elegy, mourning his treasure, and would ban feasts for an entire year. The empire had to see the Padishah breathes as a father. His death is not merely a sad episode in the dynastic chronicles, it is a point of no return. After this, Suleiman truly became magnificent only in title, while inside, a morally broken old man who had buried 2 sons by his own hand. The throne would pass to Selim, but the empire he would inherit already carried within it a crack pierced by the tears of Cihangir and the blood of Mustafa. The tragedy of one fragile man proved to be a symptom of the beginning of a long decline. The historical Cihangir is not merely the lame son of great parents, he is a living reminder of how the dynasty ruthlessly discarded its flaws. His hunchback and lameness, most likely the result of congenital scoliosis, were not simply a physical defect. The series' Magnificent Century takes this complex inner tragedy and places it upon the world's largest Turkish pedestal. Let's say it straight away, the show is honest in its depiction of physical suffering. The makeup, prosthetics, convulsions of seizures, Cihangir isn't just a little sick. He genuinely suffers on screen, and it's painful to watch. However, the creators radically rewrote the context of this pain, following the ironclad law of the soap opera. If there is suffering, there must also be forbidden love.
The climax is that legendary death from grief following Mustafa's execution. In the series, this is not a quiet fading away in a campaign tent, it is a theatrical act. It is piercing monologues, tears, embraces with his father, and a final, literal heartbreak. The creators masterfully bring all threads together in one point: love for his brother, conflict with his father, longing for his mother, and unhappy love. It is a virtuoso melodramatic compression. The key divergence lies not in the facts, but in the focus. Reality, Cihangir is a thinker, attempting to comprehend his world through poetry and knowledge. His tragedy is that of a mind locked in a frail body and cruel circumstances. The series, Cihangir is a sensitive soul whose tragedy is measured in the volume of shed tears, his and the viewer's. His main attribute is not a book in his hand, but pain in his heart. The intellectual has been transformed into a romantic anti-hero. Even the relationship with Hurrem is portrayed differently. In history, it is a mother's constant care for her most vulnerable child, reflected in her letters. How is Cihangir's health? In the series, it is overprotection, part of the grand Hurrem against everyone plan, where her son's weakness becomes both her pain and her weapon simultaneously. Both Cihangirs, the historical and the fictional, die young, but the first departs like a lamp going out in the library, quietly, leaving behind a few lines and the structure of a mosque. The second, like a curtain falling in the most poignant act of a tragedy, amidst the thunderous applause and sobs of the audience. The first is a historical detail, a victim of the system. The second is a symbol, an icon of suffering, created because we, the 21st century audience, still need every pain to have a beautiful, explicable face. And the series gave him that face, fragile, pale, with eyes full of melancholy.